So somewhere on the internet, I heard about this dish called Mississippi pot roast, and just taking a look over the ingredients got me really intrigued. This is meant to be a slow cooker meal made by a home chef named Robin Chapman from Mississippi, and it's really one of the truest American cuisine things I found on the internet. So much CPG, as the advertisers like to call it, consumer packaged goods, aka processed foods. It's something where you see the ingredients and you're like, that couldn't possibly be good, but I had to try it anyway. So I don't have a slow cooker, but I have a traditional slow cooker, aka a Dutch oven. So I'm gonna get that going over medium-high heat with a little drizzle of oil just to lubricate the bottom of the pot. And here I have 3 pounds or 1.5 kilos of beef. I asked for a chuck roast, but this is what my butcher gave me, so I'll work with what I've got. Honestly, for this, we're gonna be slow cooking it. It doesn't really matter what cut you use, because it's gonna be falling apart and we'll be shredding it later. This piece did have a ton of silver skin and straight up regular skin on it, so I went ahead and sliced that off and proceeded to cut myself, which is why I'm wearing this glove. Next, to make it into more of a roast form, I went ahead and trussed it with some kitchen twine. And if you want to see a slower breakdown of how to truss a roast, be sure to check out my chicken porchetta video that I made a few weeks ago. I'm going to season that with salt, which, spoiler alert, was not necessary. Then I'm going to brown the roast on every side in that oil. The original recipe does not call for this. It just really tells you put everything in the slow cooker and cook it until it's ready. But I wanted to get a little bit of Maillard reaction going on, just for hopefully a little bit more beefy flavor. And now come the crazy ingredients. I've got a packet of Hidden Valley Ranch. For my international viewers, this is the original. Back in the day, you'd buy this in stores and mix it with either some buttermilk to make a salad dressing or some sour cream to make a dip. It's basically a bunch of dehydrated seasonings. And now all the recipes say to sprinkle the 3-pound roast with a packet of ranch. Now maybe this is larger than the normal packet, or maybe the recipe didn't mention that you should just sprinkle on a little bit, but I went against my intuition and decided to use the whole thing. And the same goes for this au jus gravy packet, which normally you'd use to make some sort of beef gravy to use on maybe a French dip sandwich. I went with the whole packet here as well, which is, it's just a whole lot of powder. It seems like it's not going to be a very wet roast, but you'll see it'll end up actually turning out all right. Now next up, the recipe calls for pepperoncini, which are these Italian pickled peppers that are usually sold whole in brine. Now, for some reason, none of the grocery stores around me had pepperoncini, so I went with these sliced hot pepper rings, which are essentially the same thing. It might be a different type of pepper, but it's the same kind of brine that they're using in all these pickled pepper preparations, so this should do just fine. I wanted about 8 pepperoncini, so here I'm measuring out what I think would be about 8 of them. I'll place those on top of the roast. Then I need about 4 ounces or 115 mils of the brine from that jar. And I'll pour that over the top. And as if this recipe couldn't get any crazier, here's a full stick of butter that I'm going to put on top. I'll season everything with some ground black pepper. Cover it up and throw it in an oven preheated to 135°C, 275°F. The recipe's all said, set your slow cooker to low, so I just set the oven to a pretty low temperature. This is meant to go for 8 hours in the slow cooker, so as long as the temperature is above the safe eating temperature of the meat that you're cooking, it should be fine. Now I pulled it out of the oven and basted it along the way, because the top was looking a little bit dry. But as you can see, the butter and the beef juices and the pepperoncini brine melded together to create this delicious looking gravy. And I only went for 4 hours because this was already tender and falling apart and fully cooked. I can't imagine what it would be like after 8 hours, but this is where I stopped it. I cut the twine, unfurled it, and shredded it apart with my fork in the pot so that all the beef soaked up the rest of that gravy. And at this point, it looks like any sort of shredded beef, like ropa vieja or maybe pulled pork. I'm pretty impressed with how this looks. Now, originally I was going to make some garlic mashed potatoes to put this on top of, because what's better with some shredded beef than some mashed potatoes? But then I saw this crazy recipe that's been going viral where somebody made mashed potatoes out of Pringles. If you think about it, Pringles are really just potato starch, the same way that instant mashed potatoes are just potato starch. But rather than following the weird TikTok recipe that didn't even look appetizing in the end, I am going to follow the instructions on a instant mashed potato box, but use Pringles instead. So I'll throw a tube of sour cream and onion Pringles into my food processor, blitz them into a powder, and then according to the recipe on the box of potatoes, I'll throw about 300 mils of water into a pot, about 30 grams of butter, an unnecessary teaspoon of salt, and I'll bring those to a boil. Next, I'll add 115 mils of milk and slowly sprinkle and stir in the Pringles. Once they're all in there, it says turn off the heat, let them settle and sort of hydrate with the milk and water mixture, and then fluff them up with a fork. But at this point, they did not look like mashed potatoes, they just looked pretty grainy. That could have been because of how coarsely I ground the Pringles. So I just went in with a potato masher, and that actually smoothed things out pretty well. So let's plate up this processed monstrosity. These mashed potatoes do not look appetizing whatsoever. They kind of look like some plasticky mush. I did put a little bit too much butter in there because they weren't as creamy as I wanted them to be, but what ended up happening is the butter sort of separated out, so you'll see them looking quite glossy. But regardless, I'll top it with some shredded beef and a few pepperoncini rings for some added brightness. And wow, this is salty AF. I definitely should have went with my intuition and only used maybe half the packet, maybe a quarter of each packet, because, you know, in hindsight, those packets probably have a shit ton of sodium in them. But honestly, the flavor here is ridiculous. It's out of this world. Somehow the herbs from the ranch dressing, the richness from the au jus, and the acidity from the pepperoncini combine together to be perfectly balanced. Just this really amazing, rich, bright flavor. If it wasn't so salty, it would be really, really good. And as for the Pringle mashed potatoes, they taste like sour cream and onion Pringles. Now, I've never made instant mashed potatoes before, so if you're more familiar with them and you can figure out a way of making them more creamy, more like standard mashed potatoes, and you like the taste of Pringles, then I'd say try it out. You don't have to season them at all because they're already seasoned with that powder, so it's definitely something interesting to try. But that said, I'll probably get cancer from this dish, so, you know, eat it at your own risk.